Hello, Humanities 1302, and welcome to another lecture here in class. And what you'll notice is we're in a little bit different format than usual. We're going to be doing basically a Zoom recording where I'm going to be going through some lecture slides. They'll have some images. Unfortunately, with the Labor Day holiday weekend, when I recorded this on the usual transparent screen that we have in most of our lectures, it wasn't available to me. The campus is closed, so I wasn't able to get to record that. But anyways, nonetheless, we're going to go ahead and trudge ahead and go through this lecture in this format. But anyways, if this does prove to be a much better format for us, we'll probably see it used again here in the future. But anyways, the topic that we're going to be discussing today is going to be that of the Hundred Years' War. Now, for this particular lecture, we're largely just going to be giving a historical overview of this event. We're going to be discussing really the societal impacts of this conflict in both France as well as England. We're going to describe the human experience of those soldiers who were involved in this conflict, as well as what's happening back at home. And we're really going to try to put it into context with everything that we've talked about thus far in the previous weeks. And so, with that said, I do want to point out there are going to be some things that I'll mention that we've already talked about before, but nonetheless, they're so crucial to our narrative of the Hundred Years' War and eventually for the future of European conflicts, which we'll continue to talk about throughout the semester. But, anyways, as we begin the Hundred Years' War, to start, we should probably begin with the origins of this conflict. What leads to this conflict that will last over the better course, as you could probably guess from the name, of 100 years? Well, it's going to center around the old feudalistic system that we've been talking about that was in place in medieval Europe. If we remember the feudalistic system, at the top you have the king, followed by vassals, lords, and then you have lesser lords, and then all the way at the bottom you have the peasantry. But this is largely going to be a conflict that begins with those first two levels, the higher rankings of the nobility as well as the king. Now, in regards to France in particular, you have the French king that has authority over all of his lands. And just like what you see over in England, he has vassals, lords, and so forth. And one of his vassals that pays hegemony to him is actually the English king. Now, why this is the case is because if we go back to 1066 with the Norman invasion of England, when William the Conqueror conquers England, asserts his authority as the English king, he had lands as well as ties with the French king. And so, for the course of the next few centuries, it's no surprise that you see English and French culture really develop around one another. We talked about before how the English, especially the nobility, would be speaking French. They conducted business in French and so forth. So, a lot of their history was tied together. But by the 1300s, we start to see that these two nations begin to go down two separate routes. But it begins with this fight over who should have control really over the other. Now, the origin to this conflict does center around this guy we see up here on the screen, that of King Edward III of England, who was in control of England or was reigning over England at this time. In 1337, what he's going to essentially do is declare war on France by asserting his authority that he should be the rightful heir to the French throne. Recently, what has occurred in the previous decade prior to 1337 is that there was a new king of France, King Philip VI. Now, his father, King Charles IV, his sister was actually Edward III's mother. And through this, Edward III believed that he should be next in line to become the king of France, and that he had been denied this. And therefore, what he then does to try to assert his claim that he should be the rightful heir to the French throne is essentially declaring war against France. He's going to reveal his new or unveil his new royal coat of arms. Now, the royal coat of arms that we see of Edward III that's displayed here on the screen, it combines really the royal symbols that we see both in England as well as France. Now, over here on the left, what you'll see is the fleur de lis, which was the royal coat of arms, the royal symbol for the French crown. Whereas over here, you'll see three leopards. This was connecting to the royal family over in England. And by unveiling this new coat of arms, what Edward is essentially trying to do is state that he has control over both of these realms. However, by threatening the authority of King Philip VI, this is what will initiate the conflicts of the Hundred Years' War. Now, we're going to talk about the various conflicts that unfold here in just a second, but I do want to point out with the beginning of the Hundred Years' War, we won't see that it's going to be one constant conflict that will last over 100 years. There will be sporadic pieces, and we'll talk about them when we get there. But at the center of most of this conflict will be the same issues that Edward III was confronting whenever he unveiled his royal coat of arms in 1337. Now, this is where I want to turn our attention now to the Kingdom of France, because there are two areas that the English king is going to have control over, that he's going to look to assert his authority over during these early portions of the war, that he believes are his rightful lands, which do have ties back to the English throne in history. Now, the two areas that the English are going to lay claim to and really try to reconquer and really control throughout much of this conflict is going to be Gascony, that we see down here in the southwestern portion of France. And I do want to apologize. My French is not very good. I'm going to do my best, but anyways, up here in the northern portion of the country, they'd also laid claim to Pontenu. Now, with these two territories from here, the English king is going to look to expand his territories within France. And we'll see subsequent kings, and there will be five in total that will witness the various events of a Hundred Years' War. The English kings will attempt to do this. Now, before we do dive deeper into the Hundred Years' War, I do want to talk about the nature of this conflict, because as we'll see through the duration of the next 120 some odd years, really warfare is going to drastically change within this conflict. And really, after this conflict ends, we'll see really the emergence of a more contemporary, I shouldn't say contemporary, a more modern style fighting. And we'll see that technology is going to greatly sway that. But anyways, the nature of the conflict that we'll see is it's really going to witness during this war the death of the code of chivalry. Now, the reason that we see the death of this code of chivalry during this war will largely be because of technological advances as well as how armies are constructed. Now, if we remember the code of chivalry, when we've talked about it in a previous lecture, it's essentially the code that knights throughout Europe really governed themselves on the battlefield through, to where they would go out, they would fight in battle, prove their manhood. It was really the ultimate test of it. And during this conflict, which was largely characterized by single hand combat, as John Keegan calls it, to where they would be fighting hand in hand against other knights, the hope was that if they were captured on the battlefield, that the other side would respect their rights as a member of the nobility. They would hold them up for ransom. They would give them good treatment as they're in captivity, and eventually, once the ransom has been received, return them back to home. However, that code begins to fall apart because of technological advancements. What we effectively enter, and we'll talk more about it, especially when we get to the age of Napoleon a little bit later on in this course, is this will begin, or this conflict will begin, the age of black powder weapons. Now, they don't become prevalent during the war. You'll see them used by both armies at points during this conflict, but especially afterwards, we'll start to see that European armies are going to apply the tactics of black powdered weapons in a much larger scale in future wars. But we first start to see things like cannons, muskets, as well as other black powder weapons be introduced in this conflict. And how that will eventually lead to the downfall of the code of chivalry is because it will make fighting much more impersonal. You'll start to kill people from the distance, and that will greatly impact the human experience of these battles that we'll talk about in the class. But anyways, that's a topic more for when we get to the age of Napoleon. But also, talking about fighting at a distance, what's really going to be the main weapon that's going to determine a lot of battles within the Hundred Years' War is going to be the English longbow. Now, the English longbow during the Hundred Years' War is going to be the dread of the French. It's going to be able to shoot a lot farther away than any French trajectory weapons that you may see them use during this conflict. And the English are particularly well versed in archery. If you actually look over at English doctrine during this period, the hope was that much of the population would engage in some sort of archery training, so that way they could be prepared in times of war. Now, the other note I do want to mention in regards to the English longbow, which will dominate battles like Quercy, as well as Agincourt, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, is that most of those that will be archers, I shouldn't say most, all those that will be archers are going to be the rabble. They're going to be the peasantry. And so they're really going to be the ones that are going to be dictating the outcome of many of these conflicts that we'll see within the Hundred Years' War. And as a result, that's really going to also help contribute to the downfall of the code of chivalry. But we'll talk about that as we get to it later on. But lastly, the thing I want to mention with the Hundred Years' War and the nature of the fighting is we'll start to see how armies are formed are going to change. And this is also going to lead to the collapse of the feudalistic system. Now, typically, with the feudalistic system is the peasantry in times of war. When a conflict begins, they would serve off on the various fronts of that said conflict, and they wouldn't be compensated for their service. It was an expectation that they would serve their lord during times of war. However, by the time we get to this conflict, as we've been mentioning throughout class, the peasantry was beginning to gain momentum, specifically in England, in regards to the roles in societies. They were starting to get more rights and they were starting to challenge traditional authority. And during the Hundred Years' War, the vast majority, especially the English army, but also you'll see towards the end of this conflict, the French army, is going to be a more professionally trained army. The peasants that are recruited into these armies are going to be compensated in some sort of fashion. Okay, and that's something that we're going to see continue to take place throughout the next few centuries of European history. But anyways, that's a topic for a future class. But even though we do start to see the changes in the nature of the fighting during this war, and you start to see the emergence of more, I don't want to say modern armies, but modern armies, if you will continue to see some medieval practices out on the battlefield. Now, as we see these large peasant armies, it's important for us to recognize, especially very early on, the French army is still largely going to be made up of the nobility, of knights. And why that's important is because we will see a lot of these soldiers are going to engage in practices that were characteristic of the medieval period, and specifically in regards to captive taking of those knights. Remember, as a part of the code of chivalry, if you were taken captive, you'd be held up for ransom, and eventually that ransom would be paid to whoever your captor was. Now, for these peasants, the hope was that if they were to capture a knight, and they will seek them out on the battlefield, that they could hold them up for ransom, and by doing that, they could get a great amount of wealth. And we'll actually talk about this in regards to England as a whole because of the early days of the war. They will become relatively rich through this practice. But the hope was for the peasantry, if they took somebody for ransom, they could advance socially or economically because that was really the only way in the feudalistic system for them to do so. But anyways, we'll talk about all those things as we get to it. But continuing on our narrative, let's go back to Edward III and the initiation of the conflict. Now, when Edward III first initiates a conflict, it'll take some time before we start to see major battles begin to occur. There'll be several skirmishes, but really where we're going to begin our tale to where actions really begin to unfold pretty rapidly is going to be in 1346. In 1346, Edward III is going to invade France via Normandy. And going back to this map, Normandy is in the northern portion of France, the northwestern portion of France. There's several major cities there, like Cherbourg, as well as Caen, which we'll talk about here in a second. And for those of you that are buffs of World War II, you probably have heard of the importance of that region, as that would eventually be the later location of the Normandy invasion during D-Day. But anyways, he's going to invade roughly about the same beaches that the Allied forces would invade in World War II in Normandy. His first target would be the city of Caen, which is roughly about in this region here. And after taking Caen, he would conquer much of Normandy. However, the French army would eventually respond. The French king would issue out a response to the countryside, basically rallying his forces, calling his knights to battle. And the French are going to amass an army that would almost be double that of the English. And they would eventually confront them at a place called Quercy. Now, at the Battle of Quercy that unfolds, this is where the English are really going to assert their supremacy, especially with the longbow. And it demonstrates to us how warfare will begin to change over time. Now, at the Battle of Quercy, the main really fighting force for Edward's armies are going to be the archers, are going to be the peasants. In the middle, you would have his dismounted knights that would be fighting by hand whenever the French advance. But on either flank or on either side of them are going to be the British longbowsmen. Now, what the French are going to do at this battle is the several thousand French knights that are on horseback are going to ride up and attack from the front the English force. However, as they do that, they're going to be met by a storm of arrows from the English archers, and they're going to be mowed down. Now, what's really going to determine the outcome of this battle is once these first ranks of French soldiers begin to fall, especially their horses, you'll start to see that that proves to be an obstacle for other French knights coming forward. and it makes them very vulnerable. They're going to have to stop. They become basically sitting ducks for those archers, and there's going to be, I believe, the figure, I'd have to double check, but somewhere in the neighborhood of about 10,000 French knights are going to be slaughtered on this battlefield. It'll be a resounding English victory, and the first of many that would occur in the very early portions of the Hundred Years' War. But after the Battle of Crecy, the English are going to continue their advance and continue to dominate really the early battlefields of the Hundred Years' War. However, as the war continues into 1347, into 1348, there will be a new phenomenon that's going to slowly kind of stall both armies in progress within this war. And we've talked about this in a previous lecture, but this is where you'll see the outbreak of the Black Death, which in particular is going to ravage both the English but also the French countryside. And it would help really kind of deteriorate the ranks of both armies. And so, for a time being, you won't see a stalemate will occur, but military operations will slowly come to a halt, not meaning to pick up until we get to the 1350s. But in the meantime, as the Black Death is ravaging Europe, I do want to talk about what the English as well as the French are going to do, kind of promoting that old cult of chivalry amongst their armies. Now, first, I want to take a look at Edward's army, what he's going to be doing in regards to this code of chivalry, trying to promote this chivalric order. He's going to create the Order of the Garter, which is still present within England up to this present day. Now, this is really playing into the Arthurian myth that we talked about also in a previous lecture. He establishes within this Order of the Garter 26 posts that would be really Edward's most loyal supporters. However, what's interesting about this order when we compare it to, say, the Knights of the Round Table, is in order for you to be on the Order of the Garter, you had to be not put there by birth, but you had to display some sort of merit out on the battlefield. And the purpose of this is Edward wanted not these vassals that had been given their positions by birth to pledge their loyalty to him, but he truly wanted loyal subjects to be under him. And it's demonstrating to us how English society was beginning to shift during this period, even how the king was viewing society as well. On the other side, you'll see that the French under King John II, who will eventually take over the French throne in 1350, he would respond by creating the Order of the Star. Very similar. It'd be chivalric in nature. However, instead of having 26 knights that would be put there based off of their oh, what's the word I'm looking for? Off their merit on the battlefield, it would be the 500 most loyal knights that the king would select, and many of them would be put into that position because of their position at birth. And also, the other thing that I wanted to talk about in regards to the Order of the Star, these knights would pledge not to run from the battlefield, that they would engage in this old practice of the code of chivalry, carry on its traditions, and so forth. But what it probably does in the long run, at least initially during this conflict, when we see Edward III at the realm before the first peace takes place, is it puts France in a very precarious position because they're going to be dedicated to engaging in that code of chivalry, attacking the English who have superiority through their longbowsmen by attacking them through the front, trying to engage in that single combat to where they could really prove themselves. But nonetheless, they would continue to fight in such a fashion. Now, the war will continue once the Black Death begins to kind of subside at the beginning of the 1350s. And under Edward III, he would then give over really control of some of the campaigning by the fall of 1355 to his son, Edward the Black Prince. Now, Edward the Black Prince, looking at this region of Gascony, throughout the fall of 1355 and eventually the spring of 1356, is he's going to launch a series of raids into the countryside of France, particularly into this region in the fall, and then eventually into the northwest during the spring. And the whole purpose of these campaigns from the Black Prince was so that way he could pillage the countryside, raid it, and effectively destroy its economic value to France. Now, it's important for us to recognize that in order for these war machines to function, the French government, as well as the English government, they had to tax the local population. However, if you destroy much of their crops, this really inhibits their ability to tax the population, gain funding to fund their war effort. And so, by targeting the economy there, it was hoping to inhibit the war effort, but also by raiding and destroying every single city and town that they encountered within France. The hope was that this would also destroy French morale. And then eventually, this could lead to a peace that would be very favorable to the English and grant them, hopefully, for Edward III to be the heir apparent to the king to the kingdom of France. And so these raids would be very successful, and the French would not be able to catch up to the Black Prince throughout his various raids. However, in the spring of 1356, the French, once again outnumbering the English by as much as 2-1, are going to confront Edward the Black Prince near the town of Poitiers. And here, the English, once again, despite all odds, are going to gain a massive victory over the French, the longbowsmen playing a very important role. But what was more significant about this particular battle is that King John of France is going to be captured by the English. He's going to be held up and posted up for ransom. He'll be sent back to England. And as you could probably guess, if your king was captured within a battle, this was a major humiliation for the Kingdom of France. Now, for King John II, for virtually the rest of his life, he would be held in captivity over in England. His ransom would eventually be paid, but he would remain in exile in England until his dying days in 1364. But after he is captured, with the success of everything that's happened, this is where you'll see that that Edward III is going to force France to sign the Treaty of Brittany. Now, the Treaty of Brittany will be signed in 1360, and essentially what it's going to do, going to this map here, is it's going to cede all these lands in Gascony as well as over in northern France over to English authorities, giving over about a third, if you will, of France's territories. Is a major humiliation, and its reverberations would be felt out for the better course of the remainder of the century. And sewn within this treaty, while it was meant to be a lasting peace, as you could probably guess, the French are looking for an opportunity to regain those lands. And with King John II still at the throne, even though he is a regent king in his name, you won't see a whole lot of actions take place over the next 9 years. And so this essentially ends the first. This will essentially end the first phase of the conflict. And for the next 9 years, from 1360 to 1369, you'll see peace descend over the realms of both France as well as England. However, that won't be a lasting peace because, as we will see, the French are going to loathe, if you will, their British or their English overseers. I shouldn't say British because British, they're not considered British quite yet. But anyways, they'll loathe their English overseers. Now, eventually, King John II is going to die in 1364, and taking over the helm of France will be that of King Charles V. Now, King Charles V, when he takes over, he really wants to kick the English out of these territories, and the French people as well are going to be united in this effort. Now, before I talk about really the reinitiation of the war in 1369 and the beginning of the second phase, if you will, just really quickly, what happens after the English win, if you will, the first phase of the conflict, forcing the French to sign the Treaty of Brittany, is all those English soldiers that had been campaigning throughout the early days of the Hundred Years' War, they're going to be essentially unemployed. They're going to become really, they're going to go throughout the countryside, continue on a unofficial war, if you will, ravaging the local population, stealing from them, raping, and so forth, the population. And the French, because of this, they're never going to enjoy their, especially in those two regions that we see here, they're never going to enjoy their time under the English. And as a result, when King Charles V comes back to power with the French people loathing the English, it's to no surprise that we see a reinitiation of the war, and slowly the tide begin to turn in favor of the French. Now, for the second phase of this conflict, what's important for us to recognize is with the French, they understood that that code of chivalry that had really dominated their military philosophy throughout the first phase of the conflict had been a complete failure. they were not able to stand toe to toe with the British longbowsmen on these various battles. And so, with what King Charles V, as well as his military commanders, are going to establish in the second phase of the war, is that they're not going to engage in major pitched battles like Creusa or Poitiers. They're going to try to engage in more guerrilla style tactics, ambush tactics against the British to slowly drive them out of their realms. And over the course of the next decade, after fighting is renewed in 1369, slowly these territories that had been gained by the British begin to collapse, and you start to see that Bordeaux is really the only English stronghold that we see, as well as Calais to the north. And furthermore, to take the war to the English, to seek out revenge, especially for those former English soldiers who had ravaged the countryside. In 1377, King Charles is going to authorize raids against the English coastline. He begins to build a navy, conducts these raids, and as a result, this is really going to impact morale back over in England, especially on their view of the king. Now, going over to England during this time, that same year in 1377, what we're going to see is the rise of a new king. In 1377, by that point, Edward III, he was beginning to decline in health. I should say before that point, he was beginning to decline in health. And that really had contributed greatly to why the French were able to achieve a lot of battlefield successes. Many of the English people actually believed that he was senile. However, he wasn't becoming senile. He probably, if you look actually at his death mask, he probably had suffered from a series of strokes, was beginning to see a decline in health, had to rely more on administrators and so forth, and that contributed to it. But nonetheless, in 1377, King Edward III, who had been ruling over England for almost 50 years, will die, and taking over for him would not be his son Edward the Black Prince. He actually had died the previous year before his father, but is going to be let's see here, this guy right here, his grandson, who was only 10 years old at the time, that of Richard II. Now, when Richard II takes over the English crown, being 10 years of age, as you could probably guess, there's a lot of question marks over whether or not he could lead the nation. And he's going to have to rely on advisors to really advise him through the situation of what's going on over in France. And the foremost of his advisors, who somewhat will be similar to a regent king, would be that of John Gaunt, his uncle. Now, John Gaunt was the fourth son of the dead king, King Edward III. He had participated in the Hundred Years' War up to this point. He's really going to take over the war machine of the English for the next almost decade after after King Richard II takes over as the English king. However, under the policies of John Gaunt as well as Richard II, the war becomes increasingly unpopular amongst the English people. A big reason for it is because with all wars, they're going to have to raise taxes in order to fund their war effort. And two, what you also see with this raise in taxes, which hurts the peasantry, and I should point out most of the taxes are going to fall on the peasantry as opposed to the nobility. You're also going to see that the nobility are going to continue to spend lavishly. With the Black Death having occurred 20 years prior to this, we had talked about how the peasantry was really starting to have more authority, more of a say within their respective societies. And because of this, this leads directly to the events that occur within the peasant revolt of 1381. Now, with the peasant revolts of 1381, which we've already documented. If you remember, this is where I believe it's about 10 to 15,000 peasants are going to burn much of southern England. They're going to march on London. They're going to confront the Archbishop of Canterbury, as well as Richard II. And eventually the Peasants' Revolt, while it does show us a large amount of discontent amongst the peasantry, and while they do behead the Archbishop of Canterbury, it doesn't end in a success. It eventually begins to collapse after their meeting with Richard II. But nonetheless, what we do see is that the Hundred Years' War was beginning to take a toll on the English population and leading to a lot of instability back at home. Now, nonetheless, even with this instability, the war will continue under Richard II. However, Richard II wasn't as enthusiastic as his grandfather in waging war against France. And this is where I want to turn into this image right here. Now, this is the Wilton I'm going to butcher this, diptych, which is essentially an altarpiece that Richard II would have carried with him out into the field or pretty much anywhere that he had traveled. Now, with this particular altarpiece, What it demonstrates to us is the very I don't want to say peaceful nature of Richard II, but very much a disinterest in active campaigning. Now, if you look over here on the left of this image, you would see that here is depicted King Richard II. And accompanying him are going to be John the Baptist. You're going to see next to him Edward the Confessor, and lastly, Edmund the Martyr. There will be one individual who's markedly missing from this. It'd be that of St. George. Now, going back to the Order of the Garter that we had talked about there, the patron saint of the Order of the Garter is St. George, who was a 4th century, essentially warrior saint. And he really justified conflict that England had been waging against France. However, noticeably, he's absent from this image. And what it shows us in regards to Richard II, by commissioning this image, by leaving out St. George, he wasn't really interested in military matters. And it's no surprise that under his crown that he begins a process to try to declare a truce between him and the French and eventually lead to a period of peace. By 1389, a truce would be secured, and it really is meant to be a temporary truce, but it was meant to open up negotiations for an end of this conflict between Richard as well as his contemporary over in France, King Charles VI. However, no peace is going, or I should say, no formal peace is going to come. Firstly, because by 1692, King Charles VI is going to descend into madness, and we'll see that France will be divided between two groups, which I'll get to here in a second. And Richard II is also going to have to worry about his image at home. That would be greatly impacted by how he's been waging the war. Now, once Richard II has declared this truce, there's going to be a lot of question over his authority within England. Increasingly, he becomes unpopular as we enter the 1390s because of taxes and so forth. But also, we start to see amongst the nobility, they were starting to view him in a very unpopular light. And eventually, he's going to take on a guy by the name of Henry Bolingbroke, who was the son of John Gaunt, who's going to start to basically assert claim that he should be the heir apparent to the English crown. Now, to make a long story short, because there's a lot of fascinating events, what eventually happens is John Gaunt, who had left to go off on his own fight in Spain, he eventually returns, and we continue to see a rift develop between him and King Richard II. And John Gaunt, when he dies in 1397, what Richard II is going to basically do, seeing this rising discontent from the nobility, especially from Henry Bolingbroke, is he's going to strip him of his inheritance from his father, John Gaunt. Henry Bolingbroke would eventually return back to England, raise with him an army, march against Richard II, and capture him in 1399, effectively throwing him out of power and with it instituting his own rule. And this is where Henry IV, who was formerly Henry Bolingbroke, would initiate a 13-year reign over England. However, it'd be a very unsettling one. And while he would continue to initiate war with France in 1402, he's really going to have to be worried about his own domestic disputes, just like Richard II. And because of the fact that he had overthrown Richard II, there will be a lot of questions from the nobility over whether he was a rightful king. And it would be up to his son Henry V, who would take over for him following his death in 1413, to answer this question and to solidify initiating the Lancasterian dynasty. Now, Henry V, he would be remembered as a warrior king for England. Inheriting the English crown, Henry V, he's also going to have to deal with those same domestic issues that his father, Henry IV, had to deal with. And he had to deal with that domestic turmoil broken out because of the fact that many were questioning him being a rightful heir to the crown. Henry V was viewed as basically a usurper's son, that he didn't have any rightful authority over the English crown. And why does this matter for the grand scheme of things in the 100 Years' War? Is because in an effort to try to distract the English people and to unite them under his crown to demonstrate that he was a rightful heir to the English crown and that God was with him, he would reinitiate conflict or major conflict with France in 1415. Now, 2 years after he takes over the crown, Henry V, who you see here on this slide, is going to initiate his famed conflict against France. He would begin by once again invading an area very close to Normandy in northern France, and from there march, hopefully, to capture Paris and to assert his claim that he was also the heir apparent to the French crown. However, his campaign at first that would lead us down the road eventually to Agincourt is going to be a complete disaster. His army is going to be stricken by dysentery. Their numbers are going to begin to fleet. He's going to find it very difficult to take key port cities within the region. And as a result, with his army demoralized, weakened, whenever he does arrive to the fields of Agincourt, in 1415, it looks like it'd be a smashing French victory that Henry V might be removed as king. However, through almost pure luck would he prevail out on that battlefield. Now, in regards to numbers, the French heavily outnumber the English at Agincourt by as much as, if I remember correctly, about 3 to 1. There's only about 5 to maybe 8,000 English soldiers that were present at Agincourt. And it once again at this battle, even though they were demoralized, even though that they were hungry, it'd once again be the English archers who are going to determine the outcome of the battle. Now, by this point, no longer did the French army was it governed by those tactics of ambush that we had talked about that were characteristic in the second phase of the conflict that had really turned the tide in their favor and where they regained all their lands. Rather, the code of chivalry once again was dominating their ranks. The army that would have faced the English that day would have been knightly in nature, made up of thousands of nobles wanting to prove themselves in this battle to achieve the pinnacle of the code of chivalry. Now, with both armies confronting one another, what you'll see, and I do have a documentary on this battle, is the English are going to march about, I believe it's about 100 to 300 meters forward, initiate contact, and when the French actually assault the English and assault their archers, their ranks are going to be decimated. The muddy nature of the battlefield on that day is going to make it difficult for the French to advance, especially in heavy armor. And the relatively mostly rabble army, if you will, of the English will decimate the knightly army of the French. This was a resounding victory. And for Henry V, it saves his campaign and probably saves his crown. He's viewed as a hero back over in England and the rightful heir, if you will, to the English crown. Nobody's questioning his authority after this point. And following Agincourt, he would continue on a series of campaigns that would eventually conquer much of Burgundy as well as much of northern France. Now, before we continue, I do want to point out at this phase in the conflict, with King Charles VI, who was ruling over France still at this moment, with him having gone mad, a small civil war breaks out in France that's going to play in favor of Henry V. Now, in France, basically those trying to become regent kings to kind of govern for Charles VI, with his sons and his uncles combating one another, it's really divided into two groups. You have the Orleanists on one side, and then you have on the other side the Burgundians. And each side in the Civil War is going to take a side either for or against the English when they do invade. Now, the Burgundians are going to be, I don't want to say pro-English, but they're going to side with the English when they do invade to try to undermine, if you will, the authority of Charles VI. And the Orleanists are staunchly going to be anti-British, combating against him. But with a large portion of the French population in Burgundy siding with the English, this will contribute to why we ultimately see the fall of Paris into the English hands in 1419. Obviously, with Paris in English hands, this is a major humiliation, and eventually we'll see that a treaty would be struck between these two powers to where Henry V, upon the death of King Charles VI, would be the rightful heir to the French throne. He would be the first king of England as well as France simultaneously. Now, the treaty that's established in 1420, unfortunately for Henry V, he would actually not live to see himself become the king of France. He'll actually die, ironically, 7 weeks prior to Charles VI in 1422. And while his son, King Henry VI, in his teens, is going to be crowned both King of England and France, we'll also see that the son of King Charles, out of Charles VII, the Dauphin, is also going to lay claim to being the King of France. And this is going to lead to continuous warfare over who is the rightful king of France. And for a time being, we'll continue to see that the English are going to remain in control of large portions of France, but their fortunes would begin to change with this individual that we see up here on the screen. Because the French, under the Dauphin, under Charles VII, is going to gain a vital ally in Joan of Arc. Now, King Charles VII, he wasn't a military strategist. He wasn't a warrior king, if you will, like Henry V, nor could he ever lead French armies actively out on the battlefield. However, one individual will inspire the French people to rise up against the English and would actually inspire a great amount of leadership within the French army, really renewing hope, if you will, in the French nation. Now, Joan of Arc, she really comes to national prominence in France in 1429. She was not a member of the nobility, but rather a member of the peasantry, who at the age of 17 would seek out King Charles VII, essentially stating that she had seen angels as well as saints like Saint Michael visit her, that she would help basically relieve the French people of the English. And she would say, being essentially ordained by God to lead this effort, try to convince Charles VII to allow her to lead armies into the field. Now, Charles VII, as well as many members of his council, as well as his royal court, are going to very much question Joan of Arc. They're going to put her under essentially a number of tests to try to prove if she was a heretic, if she was lying. However, in the end, they are going to come to the assumption that she was ordained by God to lead France through this conflict. She would help lift the town, or the western French town of Orleans, from siege, and she would actually have a very successful military career during the couple years that she would be in charge of some French troops. However, eventually her luck is going to run out, and she would eventually be captured by the English in 1431. They would try her for heresy, and eventually she would be deemed a witch, and she would be burned at a stake as a result. And it's truly remarkable that Joan of Arc is actually put down into the historical record, but through her trial against her, where she was being tried as a witch, that's where we have definitive proof that Joan of Arc wasn't a mythical figure, but rather a historical figure. And one of the few renditions that we have of Joan of Arc during this time is the one that you see up here on the board, that was drawn up in May of 1429, near the beginning of her military campaigns. But under Joan of Arc, the tide of the war begins to turn. We see that the French armies that were under King Charles VII begin to gain a number of victories. And even though she wasn't successful in helping lift the siege at Paris, eventually the French are going to retake control of Paris by 1436. By the 1450s, the last of the English holdings in the Palais de Calais, which is in northern France, as well as Gascony, were really the only territories in English hands. However, by 1453, with another resounding French victory in the territory of Gascony, this would end the Hundred Years' War, end it in French victory, and kick the English out of France with every region except the Palais de Calais, which is just centered around the city of Calais. But anyways, for us, that brings us to the end of our narrative of the Hundred Years' War, and the end of our discussion of this topic. Now, in regards to the human element of the conflict, I'm going to leave it up to the readings for this week to go into more detail about it, what the soldiers' experience was. But we've seen just very briefly within this lecture what it did look like, as well as the impact of this war on society. Now, the next lecture that I'll be giving, we'll talk more specifically about the legacies of this conflict in English society, as well as the memory of this war. But anyways, I'm going to save that for a future lecture. But anyways, for now, before we go ahead and end this video, just like always, make sure that you go out and read all required materials, you watch all lectures from this week, complete all assignments, all of that good stuff. And just like always, if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out. But anyways, everybody go out, be safe, and I'll see everybody in the next video.